Hello everyone, good evening. Thanks for being here. It's wonderful to see the crowd that's here. And I want to thank FOR, in particular, for hosting us this evening. It's wonderful to be in this wonderful peace room. So my talk tonight was billed as my reflections on a mid-November trip to Israel and Palestine that I took. And I will share my thoughts about that journey. But since events change not just from day to day, but hour to hour in the region, I'll save time at the end of my talk for reflections with regard to the momentous events that have occurred more recently, and especially during the last week. And even before I begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about myself and how I got to be involved in scholarly and activist work in the Middle East. I grew up in an observant Jewish home. I received a traditional, and as I came to understand only much later, a very distorted Zionist education. Because of my work in a Jewish youth group, I was awarded basically a free year in Israel at the age of 19. And so impressed was I with Zionism that I was taught and that I observed, I came home saying that I would emigrate to Israel and live on kibbutz. Needless to say, my family was not too pleased with this announcement. I then entered into a period of extended late adolescent rebellion against Jewish ritual and against my Zionist upbringing. I saw myself as above all nationalisms, as a person with only universal human values. I lost touch with Israel altogether for about 25 years. This phase of my life then lasted until my mid to late 40s. In 1983, a colleague at my university told me there was this guy in Israel engaging Jewish Israeli high school students and Palestinian high school students in Beersheba in dialogue, based on the philosophy of Martin Buber. I was a Buber scholar, and Buber himself had been in favor of a binational state early on. And so I came to Israel, observed, and participated in the project. And this launched me on my current path to work for a just peace in the region. I've since made over 25 trips to the region, meeting with both Palestinians and Israelis committed to peace and human rights. And a word about encountering Palestinians. I often say to American Jewish colleagues with whom I'm talking about the conflict, that if they've not met Palestinians face to face, if they've not broken bread with them, have not observed their situation under the occupation, they can't be trusted to speak about the conflict in an informed and genuine way. Much access to the Palestinian community was given to me by one person in particular, Mahmoud Watad, a Palestinian living in the United States and teaching at my university. Mahmoud and I launched an NGO called the Israel-Palestine Oral History Project. Our first endeavor was to interview teenagers, half Israeli, half Palestinian, 34 in all. We asked them about their everyday lives, about relations with parents, siblings, friendships, hobbies, school. The idea was to put a human face on the enemy, on the other. These kids live a few miles from one another and almost never get to know or even to see one another. Palestinian kids get to see Israelis largely in uniform. Our book was published and with these kids' stories and their photographs. So what was behind my renewed and very different involvement in the region? I can cite three main sources. Although I'm not an observant Jew, I value highly the Jewish ethical tradition from which I come. Justice, justice shalt thou pursue, says the prophetic voice of Judaism. And when I work for a just peace in the region, this biblical injunction moves me. Further, the making of a just peace in this conflict is, I believe, central to any resolution of the growing enmity between many in the Muslim world and the West. Resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will not automatically resolve the larger conflict, but it will significantly lower the volume of hateful words and, more important, hateful actions. Finally, and perhaps most important, the most important motivation for doing my work, is my understanding that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a case study in the history of a seemingly unending cycle of the abused becoming the abuser. We know that children who have been abused very often grow up to be abusers themselves. If Jews, one of the most oppressed peoples in human history, a people that after 1900 years has come into power at the present, if this people can end its abusive behavior toward Palestinians, then the cycle can be broken. And I would go so far as to say that there is then hope for humanity at large to free itself from this vicious cycle. Such a breakthrough would constitute the region becoming an authentic light unto the nations. So what is my work? First, here at home, Rockland for a Just Peace in Palestine, Israel, sponsors of tonight's event, and you heard Ellen talking about it. Secondly, I'm very active in a small United States think tank called the Peace Consultancy. There are two of us working in the US, plus two hired professionals, a Palestinian Jerusalemite and a Jewish Israeli Jerusalemite. My work in the think tank is to take proposals for resolving a variety of final status issues to the conflict to missions of member states at the UN. In the last few years, I've met with over 50 ambassadors and deputy ambassadors from a large number of UN member states. And further, as a member of this think tank, I have been and am currently privileged to attend meetings with key Israeli and key Palestinian non-governmental figures. We meet in London. Finally, I'm on the board and in a leadership position in a New York City-based NGO called Partners for Progressive Israel. The mission of this organization is to educate the American Jewish community, much in need, in my view, of such education, about peace and human rights in the region. Every year, Partners for Progressive Israel offers a one-week study tour in Israel and Palestine. And during the week that I spent, in 12 days I spent in Israel and Palestine, 1 week was devoted to this study. I want to make clear at the outset that I'm an avowed two-stater. There are those who believe that two states are no longer possible, that it's 5 minutes after midnight. And there are those, myself included, who believe it's 5 minutes before midnight. When I say I'm a two-state advocate, I want to point out that there's not just one two-state solution, which involves complete separation, divorce. There are many two-state solutions. In fact, I would argue that a dichotomy between one-staters and two-staters is questionable. There are many proposals for two states in which Israelis and Palestinians at peace are linked integrally in confederations of one kind or another. While two sovereignties remain the constant in any two-state proposal, how these states relate to one another, how the walls, physical, psychological, spiritual, how these walls come down, vary with a large number of individual creative proposals. Okay, enough of me personally. What did I learn during these 12 days in Israel and Palestine? I'll divide my observations into two categories, anguish and hope, actually the title of tonight's talk. Amid what was, truth and disclosure, essentially a depressing visit, there were rays of hope. But I'll begin with the depressing news, a caveat. As I tell the bad news, it will come across as a litany of evils perpetrated by the current and recent Israeli governments. I want to say at the outset, and this is not to excuse or justify a single act of Israeli oppression, that the conflict itself is complex and that demonizing Israeli Jews is not helpful in working toward peace. I would never refer to myself as either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. I am pro finding ways to bring two traumatized peoples together in a just peace. This is not to say that I've overlooked, forgotten the asymmetry present in the conflict. The partners to the conflict are unequals. As the stronger party to the conflict, and as the party that engaged in the dispossession of a large number of indigenous people, Israel has the moral responsibility to take the initiative in creating a just peace. A final note: although I condemn outright the policies of the Netanyahu government and many governments before him, I believe, and the polls support this, that the majority of ordinary Israeli Jews wish to live side by side with their Palestinian neighbors. The same is true with ordinary Palestinians. I have faith that ultimately Jewish Israelis will work from the ground up and will hopefully soon select a government that will take the initiative to work genuinely toward this just peace. I'll say more about this when I talk about the rays of hope that I find, even given the events of the last week. So during my time in Israel-Palestine, I witnessed the growing movement to the right in the Israeli government. Government ministers on the right are becoming more and more extreme. What was once deemed extremist behavior is now the new norm. One example: several ministers from parties on the right, but not necessarily on the fringe right, have marched to the Temple Mount, Al-Haram al-Sharif, to pray vocally, thus breaking an agreement, the status quo, that allows for Muslims to pray on this site, which they've done for centuries, and allows for Jews only to visit the mount but not to pray. And I'll say more about the Temple Mount, Al-Haram al-Sharif, later in the talk. While I was in the region, there were outright calls by parties to the right of Netanyahu to pass legislation to annex the 62% of the West Bank, which is governed by Israel currently. In other words, in place of creeping encroachment without verbal dictates, today statements about annexation of at least the 62% of the West Bank I'm talking about are being made outright. During my visit, I spent a good deal of time in Jerusalem, both during the study tour and afterwards. Netanyahu and others to the right of him say of Jerusalem, and I quote, "It will remain the undivided and eternal capital of Israel." But the city is already divided. Palestinian and Jews mingle only in hospitals, and occasionally in zoos. Israel has annexed East Jerusalem, an annexation not recognized by the rest of the world, but it has not annexed the population of East Jerusalem. What do visitors from outside, especially visitors from the West, see when they visit East Jerusalem, inhabited by over 300,000 Palestinians? What do they see? They seldom get to see the ravages of the occupation, the gross underfunding of schools and of the infrastructure of East Jerusalem, for example. Lawmakers from a variety of countries say they want to see East Jerusalem, but usually accompanied by Israeli authorities, they come to make what some have called a Jewish safari. They sip cappuccino at the American Colony Hotel and then say they have visited the occupied territories. There's often violence in East Jerusalem directed against the Israeli police and army. A great deal of it occurred during my time in the region. Many of the kids see no future for themselves, and so they throw stones. Many stone throwers are arrested in Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, and of course, throughout the West Bank. Here's how it goes down. Soldiers enter the home of a child suspect in the middle of the night. Middle of the night, so that in daylight the villagers would come to protest, but at night people are asleep. They often beat up the father of the family in front of the child to instill a sense that the family cannot protect the children, and then take the young person for questioning for the rest of the night. These children are then tried in military courts. I visited the main military court in an earlier visit to the region, a sham of a justice system. Unlike Jews within Israel, who are subject to civil trials, here Palestinian youths are most often not told that they can remain silent, that they can have representation by attorneys, and so on. And when they return home after imprisonment, they're often not the same person. One young man whose testimony I heard on the West Bank requested that upon his return home, he be allowed to sleep on the roof of his house. He could no longer fit into the family life as it once was. Yet more. In East Jerusalem, there is an ongoing encroachment by the settler movement. 2,600 settlers now live in Palestinian areas of East Jerusalem. The issue here is not quantity. These 2,600 live among 300,000 Palestinians, but the encroachments are targeted so as to isolate Palestinian communities from one another and to make a contiguous Palestinian state difficult at best. A perfect example of what some call spatial shaping. Further, what was and still is primarily a political conflict over land is beginning to morph into a religious war, one that cannot easily, or perhaps even ever, be resolved. The Temple Mount, Al-Haram al-Sharif, is the center of this aspect of the conflict. It's a powder keg, drawing extremists like magnets. Those who come to the Mount with intent to appropriate the site to themselves, those who would weaponize faith, are becoming more and more prominent. Al-Haram al-Sharif is a flashpoint in the conflict. With regard to settlements in general, there are now more than 360,000 settlers on the West Bank, not including the Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem. Settlers grow at the rate of over 10,000 a year. The number has doubled since 2003. Now, there have been few new settlements as such in the last 10 years. However, satellite communities near established settlements, communities called outposts, have sprouted, have mushroomed. There are now over 100 of them. Here's the usual process for the building of a new outpost. At first, a mobile home appears a kilometer or so from a settlement. The justification for placing the mobile home at that distance for the settlement? Security. But the armed settler who occupies a mobile home now wishes to bring his wife and kids to live with him. But water and electricity is then required, and then neighbors to keep the initial family company. You can see how the process goes. The outposts are mini settlements. One that I saw was large enough to have a bus stop within it. Although outposts, as distinct from settlements, are considered illegal by Israeli law itself, the Israeli government justifies its inaction in removing them because of its concern about the possibility of civil insurrection, even civil war. Settlers have power incommensurate with their numbers. And the response of the majority of Israelis to settlement construction, making the partition of the land into two states more and more difficult. Many Israelis live in a bubble, live in denial, failing to see the occupation just a few miles away from them. This is a psychological wall. The security barrier wall is a physical shield, disallowing any possible contact that might otherwise take place. I would say that I've had more contact with Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank than most Israelis. During our week study tour, we visited Hebron, called by many the armpit of the occupation, the place where extreme Jewish nationalism has coalesced. Hebron is a city sacred to both peoples. It's here where the patriarchs and matriarchs are supposedly buried. It's here that Abraham greeted the strangers in the biblical tale. Abraham didn't just walk toward the strangers, but ran to them in hospitality, so says the Hebrew Bible. Ironically, the place where the meeting took place is now a little park that's off limits to Palestinians. How sad when you realize that at this burial site of the common father of Muslims and Jews, their sons Isaac and Ishmael, we are told, jointly buried their father Abraham. According to the Wye River Agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority in 1998. This was an addendum to the Oslo Accords. The city of Hebron is divided into two. Hebron 1, home to about 160,000 Palestinians, and Hebron 2, where 30,000 Palestinians live, in the midst of whom live about 500 settlers, guarded around the clock by 550 members of the Israeli Defense Force. H2 has been hell for Palestinian residents. 1,800 stores have been closed, roads have been placed off limits to Palestinian vehicles, and in some cases to Palestinians walking on foot. Pregnant Palestinian women often leave in their 5th month for fear that the checkpoint leading to hospitals in H1 will be shut. The Jewish settlement in Hebron is not about security, as is claimed, but about control. The idea is to make Israel's presence felt, to sear the consciousness of the other. An example, while some of the 550 soldiers, busy with their task of keeping the peace, when they become frustrated with their inability to watch a major soccer game scheduled on television, some enter Palestinian homes at random, gather all the residents, lock them in a room, and proceed to watch the game on the home's television set. In addition, homes are entered randomly a few nights each week, ostensibly to search for weapons, but the idea is to make the occupation a visceral fact. And rather than tell you more about Hebron, when I complete the talk, I'm going to show 10 minutes of what it is like in Hebron. The film is made by ex-Israeli soldiers who during their army service did serve in Hebron, but who have since rethought their involvement in the occupation and who have formed an NGO called, fittingly, Breaking the Silence. Okay, I want to speak about some sources of hope. Sources from the outside world. One country after another is currently recognizing Palestine. Of the 193 nations at the UN, 134 have recognized Palestine as a non-member observer state. Many more have begun individually, one after another, to recognize Palestine as a state in its own right. There's a groundwell of support from the outside world. Israel is becoming increasingly isolated. Further, in the realm of hope, there are many secret Track 1 and Track 2 initiatives underway. Israelis and Palestinians who occupy government positions, Track 1, often meet out of sight of the press and the people. And then there are Track 2 meetings, meetings composed of Israelis and Palestinians who do not have government positions, but who are influential with regard to government policies, and whom we frequently, most often in Europe, particularly in London, to talk about peace. And finally, there are also Track 3 initiatives, centered around the Abrahamic tradition, shared by both Jews and Muslims. And there are sources of hope from inside Israel. There's the possibility of a new coalition coming to power in the upcoming March elections. Although elections in Israel had not been announced while I was in the region, it was evident that they were in the works. There are cracks under the surface of the current government. Netanyahu's popularity has decreased. Many Israelis, even those in the center, are increasingly dissatisfied with his failure to act. A new coalition of 2 left-center parties has attracted much attention. The polls at this moment still give the right wing a first crack at forming the next government, but these same polls show a very close race. Whether or not a new center-left government, should it win the March 17th elections, whether such a government, a new government, will be willing to negotiate toward a just peace is still a question. But for the first time in many years, a hopeful alternative to Bibi Netanyahu beckons. What about those who say that the presence of 360,000 plus settlers in the West Bank, not counting those in East Jerusalem, what about those who say that the encroachment of these settlers on Palestinian land has made 2 states impossible? The prevailing view among the center and left in Israel is that settlers can and will be removed so as to allow for a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. And this is possible in large measure because the final peace agreement will, it is said, likely consist of land swaps, in which, as has been discussed in one negotiation after another, 2/3 of the existing settler population will remain in place in land that becomes Israel. Palestine, in turn, will be compensated by receiving an equivalent amount and quality of land from what was previously Israel, thus preserving the criterion for peace that would be based on the 1967 borders. The problem is not the feasibility of moving settlers out of the West Bank, but the will on the part of Israel to do so. Most Israelis, like their Palestinian cousins, want there to be two states. The same majorities, however, disbelieve that a two-state agreement is really wanted by the other side. And what about those who say there will be civil war within Israel if the settlers are removed, and that therefore the government will never remove settlements? What I heard from NGO leaders during my time in the region was that opposition to withdrawal may well not be violent if it's done in the context of a genuine peace process for which most Israelis yearn. Further, there's now a partnership among Sunni Arab countries that supports an agreement between Israel and Palestine, in part to counter the influence of growing Shia power in the region, in Iran, Hezbollah, and elsewhere. And there are sources of hope from NGO initiatives. Often people-to-people initiatives, such as dialogue groups or grassroots groups formed around a certain common goal, often these initiatives are given short shrift by those who say that it's only overt political action that will end the occupation. In my view, what we have here is not an either-or, not a dichotomy between peacemaking that takes place on the grassroots level and peacemaking undertaken by political action. It's a both-and. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is between two traumatized peoples. One people traumatized by the dispossession of 700,000 who were forced in almost all instances to flee their homeland in 1948, now about 6 million in number. Another, people who suffered from anti-Semitism during 1900 years of exile, culminating in the murder of 1 out of 3 Jews alive during the Holocaust. Any and all actions, overtly political or not, that can heal suffering from trauma that has extended itself into succeeding generations, any and all such actions are needed. Here's one example of the over 100 grassroots NGOs composed of Israelis and Palestinians working for peace, groups that we don't hear a lot about in the media. Hanging Out for Peace is a project that utilizes video conferencing for peacemaking. Some of you may know that Hanging Out is a program. 504 kids meet face-to-face with professional translators available as needed. After 4 hangout sessions, these youths must not just meet in the digital world and then go home. They commit to developing joint projects, such as visits to common religious sites and visits to each other's schools. Finally, the BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanction Movement. The BDS movement has had and promises to step up its influence on the Israeli government leaders. This is true especially when European states threaten boycott. Israel, in fact, entered into the abortive 2013-14 Kerry-led negotiations largely because the UK had begun to boycott settlement-related organizations and settlement products. Issues surrounding BDS abound, and I'm sure there will be questions about it which we can talk about in the question and answer period. Now, with regard to key events that have occurred more recently, especially the important events of the past week. As you've undoubtedly heard, the Palestinians submitted a resolution to the UN Security Council on the night of December 29th. The resolution calls for 2 states based on the 1967 borders, And it sets a year's deadline on completing the negotiations and a 2-year deadline for ending the occupation. France had been working intensively with the Palestinians since early to mid-December to shape a draft that would ease some of the terms the Palestinians wanted, but terms that most alarmed Israel and Washington. France wanted, for example, to soften the deadlines, a red line for Israel and the US, by extending the time for negotiations and withdrawal and calling for negotiations to proceed under an international umbrella. The hope was to avoid a US veto, to get the US to abstain, and to have all the other 14 nations in the Security Council adopt it unanimously. In fact, they were making progress when, just before the 25th of December, Palestinians made a decision to submit their own draft, hardening their positions, and I say hardening only from the perspective of attempting to avoid Israeli condemnation and a US veto. So why did the Palestinians reject the French effort at collaboration? Most political commentators argue that Mahmoud Abbas was responding to the Palestinian street, that after 47 years plus years of occupation, was, to say the least, completely frustrated and wanted to see action on the part of the Palestinian Authority, unambiguous action. Abbas had to act. He had lost much of his backing since the Gaza war, in which Hamas showed that despite the terrible cost, it was prepared to act. The resolution needed 9 of the 15 countries in the Security Council to vote yes for it to pass. But the measures I've mentioned that alarmed the US, that were included in the resolution, made it easier for the US to peel away enough support to yield the final result of the voting on the 31st. 9 yes votes were needed. The resolution received 8. The result of the vote, 8 yes, 5 abstain, 2 no, the US and Australia. The US put pressure on Nigeria and South Korea during the final days before the vote. The only good news that came out of the voting no is when Samantha Power, the US ambassador to the UN, in the course of explaining the US reasons for voting no, did speak clearly about a future of 2 states based on the 67 borders, something that had raised great concern in Israel when Obama mentioned it just a few years ago. What happened next is known to many of you. As a result of the defeat at the Security Council, the Palestinian Authority exercised what some have called its nuclear option, asking to join the International Criminal Court in The Hague, a court which the Palestinians believe will hear its charges against settlement building in general and the targeting of civilians during this past summer's Gaza war. Some immediate responses from Israel. It has withheld over $227 million of tax money collected by Israel each month on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. This was the $237 million in the month of December, but it threatens to withhold tax revenues every month beyond December. There are threats on the part of Israel to make travel for Palestinian Authority officials more difficult. There are threats to bring cases of alleged Palestinian war crimes before the court. This is a sophisticated game of chicken. Responses from the US, who says it voted no because aside from the issue of time limits, the resolution did not address Israel's security needs. There are threats by many in Congress, lobbied by the Israel government at the moment, to do whatever they can to put an end to annual subsidies of more than $400 million to the Palestinian Authority, as well as looking into the legality of closing the Palestinian Authority office in Washington. Responses from Palestine to the withholding of taxes by Israel. They're exploring the following: ending security coordination with Israel and the West Bank. Right now there are joint patrols, Israelis and Palestinians, in the West Bank. And without the help of Palestinian security forces, Israel would certainly struggle to curb violence. Next, a more dramatic measure that is being talked about: collapsing the Palestinian Authority altogether, handing over the territories, including Gaza, to Israel, which would then take responsibility for education, healthcare, and other services for 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and 1.8 million in Gaza. This would do two things among others. It would certainly be a huge budgetary blow to Israel, and yet more important, it would make the occupation more stark. The world would see it writ large on the international stage. All of this is very recent. The jury, this is the last week. The jury is out on the ramifications of Palestinians going to the ICC. But the immediate consequences will most likely include a bump in favor of the Netanyahu government in the coming elections. Now Netanyahu could say, see, the whole world is indeed against us. We can talk about these developments in greater detail during our discussion. The final word. Let us all work for a just peace in this troubled region. The status quo is impossible to maintain from both an ethical and a reality-based assessment of the situation. May we come to see the day when an authentic and just peace reigns in the region. Thank you.